Brett Wells, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation with you. And for the listeners, we actually recorded a couple of weeks ago, and then I ended up having problems with the file, and it was corrupted, and so I wasn't able to use it. And so we had to reschedule to redo the interview and continue the conversation. So that's what we're doing today. Brett was kind enough to reschedule, and we're going to be talking today about COVID-19, vaccinations, and using data when planning to get our people back to work. And Brett Wells does a lot of research in this area. Brett, as we get started, I just wanted to share your bio with everybody. Dr. Brett Wells is the Director of People Analytics at Perceptix, Inc., helping clients connect the dots between their people, data, and business outcomes to make better decisions. For over the past 10 years, Brett has served as a consultant to leaders at Fortune 500 companies, including Amazon, ExxonMobil, AT&T, Citigroup, Delta Airlines, Estee Lauder companies, and so forth, aiding in the creation and implementation of people analytics strategies and solutions. Brett received his PhD in social and industrial organizational psychology from Northern Illinois University. A recognized thought leader on emerging workforce trends, employee listening, and people analytics, he has published over 40 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and conference papers, most recently on data visualization in the Cambridge Handbook of Technology and Human Behavior. What a tremendous background. It is truly a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you today. And as we discussed last time, and the listeners didn't get a chance to actually hear, it's really fun, talking with people that have similar types of backgrounds. You have the scholar practitioner orientation and background. That's something that I try to foster as well. And our disciplines are close cousins. So you're IO Psych, I'm organizational sociology, and there's a lot of overlap there in what both of us do in terms of our academic research, but also in terms of our practitioner work, our consulting work. So it's a pleasure to have a conversation with a close cousin.
Yes, we R&D across the lines, and by R&D I mean rip off and duplicate. So we do quite a lot of overlap between sociology and the study of leadership over there, and then how that transcends into IO and social psych. So it's one big happy family in that social sciences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I teach and I research in a business school. So that brings the connection and the overlap even closer, because so much of what I do nowadays is in the social psychology realm anyways, pushing the envelope of what I did in my PhD. So anyways, lots of fun. Great to have this conversation with you. Before we really launch into the discussion, anything else you would like to share by way of background or personal context for listeners?
No, I'll just share that I absolutely love what I do every day. It's great to go into an organization where you're passionate about the mission and what we're doing and really helping clients. And at the end of the day, it's all very much purpose driven and helping to make the world of work just a better place for everyone by listening to employees and acting on that feedback. And now during 2020, it's more important than ever before, and going into 2021 to really listen to employees, understand their concerns and anxieties and the burnout and everything that we're facing, and try to make it as best as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And the employee experience, I think, is so essential for any successful organization, especially if we're talking about success beyond the short term. If we're looking for long-term sustainable success, productivity, and innovation, you have to support your people. You have to listen to your people. You have to create a safe environment where they can speak up. All of these types of elements that, I talk with guests on the podcast about all the time. Now, your expertise, I mean, in addition to, the areas that you just mentioned, which you clearly have a lot of expertise in, I know recently you've been doing a lot of work in relation to COVID-19 and the vaccinations and the data around that. In wide scale surveys and in talking to different companies to better understand how they're grappling with it and what, really what the attitudes are about employees around getting vaccinated, returning to work, and those sorts of things. What can you tell us by what you've been finding so far?
Yeah, so first I'd say that many companies have changed their listening strategies as we've been thrown so many curveballs with the pandemic and social injustice and What I would say, and maybe a little context, so at Perceptics, we work with roughly 30% of the Fortune 100, 20% of the Fortune 500 organizations. So, multifaceted, large enterprises with big footprints and have complex problems. And what we've seen is still today, those organizations, about 95% of them do an annual census survey. So that one or twice a year, we're going to canvass the entire organization and ask questions to help drive decision making for leaders and make that employee experience better. What we've learned, though, with all these curveballs, is more and more organizations are adopting a more frequent listening strategy. So just in the course of the pandemic, we've collected nearly 1 million data points or from 1 million respondents and across all these different organizations, because they wanted timely data to make better decisions going forward. So that's been certainly a large change that I've seen in terms of just how listening strategies changed through the pandemic. Organizations are asking far more frequently and more in the moment. And gone are the days of asking questions like, I'm happy at work. You can't really do much with that, but you can when it's very actionable. So I think of how onboarding experiences have changed. It's like, have you met with your manager the first day you're on the job? That's something that's actionable. If you're seeing that a large percentage of your new hires aren't meeting with their managers, that's something you can act on to improve that experience. Or they've been given a stretch assignment within the first 30 days to really stretch their thinking within the new role. So a variety of things can be actioned. And that's where I think leaders are going far more towards, as opposed to the traditional, I'm happy at work, I've got a friend at work, these things that aren't really actionable and don't provide a lot of value to leaders. Like, what do I do now? I kind of get a sense of it's good or bad, but what do I do next? What do I do now?
Yeah, that's interesting. And several of the elements that you just referred to, I recognize as part of the Gallup Q12 instrument, as well as probably many other satisfaction and attitude surveys, right?
Sure.
And so, I'm curious, what do you replace those types of questions with to get more at the actionable elements?
Yeah, I think those items are great, and there's a lot of research, meta-analyses by, I believe, Hunter and Schmidt, the grandfathers of meta-analysis, that show that those items predict important outcomes. Where it falls short is, how do you act on those? And that's where I think the antecedents of those things really come into play. So what does it mean to be happy at work? Well, it means I have a manager who cares, that I have career and development opportunities, and the laundry list goes on. And you can see what are the levers that really affect one's satisfaction, engagement, going above and beyond the role, and affect important business outcomes, productivity, turnover, profitability. All those things matter to businesses, but it's really getting at, what are the drivers of engagement? What are the barriers that are getting in the way of engagement? Let's focus on those, which are far more actionable than the traditional questions that you see in these composite engagement items. And we even have those composites too at Perceptics. We've got, just as the Gallup has their Q12, we've got our standard that that touch on similar areas, but it's hard to act on those. We look instead at what are the drivers of those, which ultimately affect outcomes.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I notice the evolution of this research, right? Because 2-3 decades ago, it was all about employee happiness and satisfaction. And then it started to shift towards employee engagement and employee experience. And now we're continuing to see the shift more towards these actionable driver elements of what can leaders actually do, like in the real world, day to day, what can they do each and every day to make a difference in the lives of their people. And so that's excellent that that's your approach. And that's definitely what the organizations of today need, I think, to improve moving into the future.
And one last thing, Jonathan, I'd mention is where most organizations see struggle and heartache is on the action planning process. It's not the number of questions or the frequency, but when you look at the literature, like where organizations fall short and struggle the most is action planning. And I think it's because action planning gets in the way of action taking. So another shift that I've seen is organizations putting far more value on taking action and disseminating information to managers much quicker. So that delay that used to be months during the pandemic, that got shortened down to days, if not hours in some cases. And managers could see at their fingertips, here's the 1, 2, or 3 things that I should do. Pick one of them. Then 2, do 2 things about it. And here's some ideas of what you can do. And 3, commit to meeting with your team 3 times to discuss these issues. That has gone to tremendous lengths of improving the experience. Organizations that have followed this, because there's such variety and variation in our database and clients that are doing that to the best they can, and those that are just, so to speak, inching into that way of thinking. Those that are at the leading edge, they're 10 times more likely to demonstrate significant gains in their employee experience and those metrics that we've already talked about than organizations that are just going through the motions of asking questions and having that long delay and not really acting on the data.
Right. And that's what I've experienced also in some of my own consulting work is half the battle is getting them to take the data and the analysis of that data, the responses from their people, and then actually acting on it, right?
Yeah.
Taking it and not just looking at it and holding a meeting and talking it over. This is something that we were actually just experiencing at my university just in the last month or so is, we're part of this annual best places to work in higher ed survey that most universities do. And they were holding their annual meeting to discuss, the upward or downward trends across a lot of these different attitudinal variables. And the reality is they really don't do much because of it. And they're not, I don't say that to point a finger at the university. I think that's like not atypical for organizations to get the data, kind of talk it over, and then they just shelve it and then they move on. And so the point is we need to get past that. We need to actually leverage the data and leverage the information to make informed decisions that will improve the situations of everyone around us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we get too enamored by benchmarks and where do we stack rank against others that we're competing against for talent or students, in your case. And instead it's where's our most pressing challenges? Let's put some action on those and you'll see everything else cascade and follow.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
More of that internal focus versus external.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about the vaccines and getting people back to a physical workspace. You've surveyed, 1 million people, you have all this data. What have you been finding?
Yeah. So interestingly, there were some things that took me by surprise. So I was thinking, and this is my own bias going into it, that the vaccines were this glimmer of hope at the end of the tunnel. We're all looking forward to the days of getting back to work and what that'll entail. But when we ask employees, what are the list of safety measures that make you feel safest going back? And we ask them to project about, well, what about getting the vaccine, or if every employee got the vaccine? And mask wearing ranks number 1 still, followed by social distancing and frequent sanitizing, cleaning, and then finally the vaccine. So despite us all thinking this is a glimmer of hope, it's not necessarily any stronger than the measures that are already in place. And secondly, we see that across our research and even like Pew Research Center and a variety of others that are asking just Americans their plans to get vaccinated, somewhere between 50 and 70%, depending on which poll you're looking at and how you're sampling, is what we're finding. But organizations can go a long way to helping to incentivize their employees. So one, just recommending that employees get vaccinated does a large impact. About 1 in 10 more people will go get vaccinated just as a result of that. And then you layer on these small incentives. So giving off time of work or even just a small monetary incentive increases that employee's likelihood. One of the final surprises that I saw was that essential workers were actually the least receptive to getting the vaccine. And I thought, like, geez, here are these people going in every day to work, putting themselves in harm's way. I think they would be the ones lining up at the front lines to get that vaccine. But kind of diving in and at least our hypotheses around it, they've already found out ways to be safe by the mask wearing, social distancing, frequent cleaning that have kept them, their family safe. And while the vaccine is probably welcomed by open arms, like people like me, not essential workers that are working and living in the basement, for those essential workers, this is a nice to have, and they've already found strategies and ways to make this work in the real world. So that was another surprising effect, that essential workers are at least telling us that they're less likely to want to get that vaccine.
Yeah, interesting. Excuse me. And have you seen this any shift over time? I mean, we've now been in the middle of this for what, 10, 11 months?
Yeah,
How
not
has
necessarily.
this
Yeah,
changed in terms of public
yeah.
perception?
You know what I would say? The biggest thing that I think has changed, at least from some recent research that we've been looking at, is one's receptivity to want to go back to the office. So at the beginning of the pandemic, people wanted to go back. They were missing it. And as we kind of got towards the summer, more and more people wanted to keep working from home. So less than 5% wanted to go back to the physical workplace full time. Today, that number has shifted to a little higher than 30%. So I think the allure of working from home for the rest of your life has worn off. Many people want a hybrid model. And when we ask that hybrid, how many days would you want to go back to the office? We're finding that women want to stay more days at home, working from home. And you think of how this pandemic has affected them, especially working mothers, at a much different way than working fathers. So we found that working fathers have expressed more stress in their responses, and it's taking a toll on them. But women, we're seeing that they're exiting the workforce at faster rates. They want to take pauses. They're playing so many roles and wearing multiple hats. They're the worker, they're the mother, they're the teacher, they're the short order cook. Like, they're having so many these hats that they have to wear during the day, that we're seeing that's taking a toll. And especially for women in leadership positions, it's incredibly taxing right now. So I think many of us will want that hybrid model going forward, and that's only going to incur additional business problems to solve for, in terms of how big does our office need to be? How do we need to distance people? Do we need to close offices? Do we need to open more offices? So there's all these economic and business decisions that have to be made. And there's no better way to figure that out than actually ask your employees what their preferences are, because we do see differences by gender, industry, age. I mean, you name the demographic, there are slight differences. So understanding more about what your people want is far more important than kind of getting a brushstroke cursory review of our research. It'll point you in the right direction, but there's no better data than asking your own employees.
Well, absolutely. And we have to be really careful to just assume that we understand where they're coming from. And as you just mentioned, there's a lot of ways to slice your data, and you do see differences across groups, but even within those groups, they're not a monolith. And so people have their own unique situations and their own unique attitudes and desires. And so there's really no substitute for just a manager getting to know their people and understanding their needs and their situation. And, to the extent possible, that an organization can actually just provide accommodation in a flexible way, dependent on the needs of a particular employee, I think is ideal. But it does, raise challenges. How do you effectively manage a remote team, or a half remote team and a half in-person team, and make sure everyone feels a part of what you're doing, and that the creativity can flow? I mean, all of this brings with it complexity. And I think about the physical space issue, like you said. Again, I know it's a little bit different talking specifically within higher ed, but at my university, that's something that we're wrestling with. Unlike many universities across the nation, just due to the demographics in our area, we continue to grow 5 to 7% student enrollment growth every year for like the last decade. And even with the pandemic, we're not really seeing that slow down. And so The physical space has always been an issue in terms of classrooms and in terms of adding more faculty and more faculty offices. And then all of a sudden the pandemic hits, and overnight classes go online, right? And now the whole campus, this whole physical campus is sitting virtually empty. And most of the time I work from home for the past year, but every now and then I go into campus and it's a ghost town, like nobody's there. And so it raises this question, like all of these expensive buildings that we've been building as fast as we possibly could because of this continued growth. And moving into the future where more online courses will become more normal, more live streaming courses will become more normal. I'm sure there will be many students anxious to get back to the physical classroom when possible. But in the interim, it does raise the question, how much of this space do we need? And I think of just for the employees, so many, like most of the employees, both staff and faculty, are working from home right now, and there's all this office space. So if I get really comfortable with this idea of like, I love working from home, it's flexible, I'll go into campus when I need to, otherwise I'll just work from home, but I have a dedicated office, on campus, and then you multiply that by, 1,000 faculty, that's a ton of wasted space, right? And so that now they're having all these discussions about work from home agreements and shared office spaces, and they're trying to figure out all that. And, there's no easy answer to it. And it's also, I think, to your point earlier, my attitude has probably shifted over time, over the last month, the last 11 months. I'm sure other faculty, other staff have as well. And that's just one organization, right? Multiply that by all of the companies, all of the employers across America, across the world, who are wrestling now with this. Do we need people there in person? If we have a flexible hybrid model, how do we implement that fairly? How do we give people the flexibility and accommodations they need while also meeting the business needs of the company? These are answers we don't have quick and easy answers. These are questions we don't have quick and easy answers
Right.
to, but we definitely need to ask the questions and then listen carefully.
And you bring up a good point that I think deserves to be repeated, and that's that perceptions can change and do change often. So just as organizations want new data to make better decisions, us as decision makers, as we have new experiences and more data is flowing in, and we can change our perceptions as well. And that's the importance of continuing to ask and respond. It's this nice game of Marco Polo that I call it, where you ask a question, you're going to get a response, and you try to get a little bit closer to that desired target. And that's why you keep asking. Otherwise, you're never going to catch the other person in the pool, so to speak. So with that, it's important to continuously ask and respond. The downside, or I guess not necessarily the downside, but the only recommendation I would give is ask as frequently as you can respond. What we do see across our clients, time tested, is that if you continue to ask questions and don't respond, well, participation rates drop dramatically. And implicitly, you're telling your employees that you don't value their voice, their opinions, you're not acting on those data. But if you connect the dots for employees, we're asking these questions because here are the challenges we're going to face. Here's the direction we're going. Now let us know, how's this working? Here's how we pivoted. It's important not just to ask, analyze, and make decisions, but you really have to connect the dots for employees. That's really going to drive participation. And that's far more of the organizational effectiveness, organizational development side. I spend my time far more on the mathematical and analytical side, but then people have to put it into practice and really see the benefits of all those analytics. Otherwise, it's just going to die on the vine and participation rates drop. You don't really see any improvements in that employee experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just helps generate more buy-in, and more connection between the employees. And as you mentioned, nobody wants to take a survey if they think nothing's going to happen with it. And employees can get pretty cynical pretty fast. So if you're not being open and transparent, you're going to be setting a negative tone at exactly the moment where you need more openness, more communication, more listening, more collaboration. So exactly, just reiterating what you just said, we need to make sure that we are absolutely focusing on not only listening, but then feeding back and sharing with our people to help them understand how what they shared has impacted things. Well, Brett, it has been a real pleasure talking with you. We could go on, and perhaps I could have you back again on a future date to talk about more of the research that you're doing and some of the trends that you see, not just in relation to COVID and vaccinations or hybrid work models, but really you're doing such fascinating work. I would love to have you back. Before we close today, though, any final thoughts that you have, and would you mind sharing with listeners how they can get connected with you, find out more about your business, and anything else that you'd like to share in closing?
Yeah, well, first, I'd love to come back. This has been a great conversation. I would say stay tuned for 2 research studies that we have coming down the pipe. So one is our second study in partnership with Josh Burson Academy, and we're focusing on over 80 business practices, which ones really drive diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's exciting. That's coming out this month in February. The one punchline I'll tell you, one of the most important factors is listening and responding to employees. So everything that we talked about today cascades over into the DE&I space. Secondly, we're rethinking HR this year. With 2020 throwing so many curveballs, 2021 is a way to get that blank sheet of paper and focusing more on business problems. And one area that's been disrupted heavily is onboarding during pandemic. So people still have to hire new employees, and we're doing a deep dive in terms of which practices really matter, both from the employer side as well as a candidate side, because often those expectations and the desires aren't necessarily matched. So we're going to kind of pit both against each other and study that. And then I'd love to connect with your listeners. You can reach me on LinkedIn, just search for Brett Wells. You can reach my email at bwells@perceptix.com, just spelled like Perceptix right there. And please follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter at Perceptix. And you can go to our website and see a lot of the research studies that we talked about today and a whole list of many more that we didn't get time to talk about.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Brett. It has been a real pleasure. I really encourage listeners to reach out, get connected with Brett, get connected with Perceptix, find out more about the research and what they can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.